Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I am Jeffrey Sterling, Surgeon General for Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, and on behalf of our General President, Brother Dr. Willis Lanza III, and our Board of Directors and the Deputy Surgeon Generals, thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to this evening's program. We're going to be talking about grieving, and we want all of us that go through this episodically and maintain it on a daily basis to not only be informed about grieving, but to be empowered to deal with it. And that's what we're going to be discussing this evening. Joining me this evening are two very important individuals. One is a Brooklynite and one is a Chicagoan. So, of course, we'll start with the Chicagoan. Brother Dr. Melvin Hinton is a licensed clinical psychologist and is currently the chief of the Office of Mental Health Management Systems for the Illinois Department of Corrections, where he has 21 years of clinical experiences working in correctional settings, including the Cook County Department of Corrections and similar facilities in California and Lake County and Waukegan, Illinois. Dr. Hinton is also an adjunct professor at St. Francis University in Joliet. He has taught as an adjunct professor at Chicago State University, Western International University, and has guest lectured at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology and at Olive Harvey in Chicago. He is eminently qualified to have this conversation with us. And all that said, it's always important to point out that he considers his most important positions are a husband and father to his 11-year-old son. So welcome. Our second guest is Brother Dr. Walter Wilson Jr., who was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. He conducted his undergraduate work at Howard University, where he received a bachelor's in psychology, and he has received a master's of science degrees in both neuropsychology and anatomy from Howard, where he then went on to attain a master's in healthcare administration from the University of Minnesota and graduated from the Stony Brook University School of Medicine in 2015. So I want to thank both of you for joining us, and let's just jump right on in. I guess I should also point out, Dr. Wilson, that you currently work for Health Point Family Care Incorporated, which is a federally qualified health center in Covington, Kentucky. So let's get right to it. And without further ado, I know that we have a lot of people that have already commented here and just found the whole concept of grieving fascinating. So either one of you gentlemen, come on in and let's talk about the process of grieving. Everyone may be familiar with the Kubler-Ross criteria. So jump on in and let's just have a brief conversation about normal grieving.
Why don't I start off, brother? Good evening or good afternoon. It's 6:03 in Chicago, so good evening, my time, to you two and to the listening audience. Very honored to be here again with you all to talk about grief and the grieving process. And certainly for the general audience, I want to make it clear that when we talk about grieving, it's a process that we all have to go through and all have to endure. There are multiple stages of grieving. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about how people cope with grieving. We're going to talk about the process for grieving to kind of shift right into maybe more depression, more anxiety on a kind of clinical scale. But we'll get to that, as things kind of unfold. I want to make it clear that there are multiple ways that people grieve. There is no right or wrong way to grieve. There may be some maladaptive coping that people utilize, start excessively drinking, being in denial, things of that nature to the nth degree. But there's no specific formula for how you grieve. People probably are familiar with the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief. They've kind of been around, tested since the 80s, I believe. The denial phase, the anger phase, bargaining phase, the depression phase, and finally the acceptance phase. Without boring everyone to tears, going over that, I will simply say that they're not a linear process, right? One doesn't have to start in denial and then progress to anger, bargaining, so on and so forth. They can jump from stage to stage at various times. But if you've gone through a grieving process, grieving the loss of a loved one, a mother, a spouse, family member, grandparent, things of that nature, it's a good chance that you have hit one of these 5 stages. And very briefly, when we talk about denial, it's akin to saying, this can't be happening, right? You just don't want to face the fact that your loved one has passed away, or that someone that you care about has passed away. When you talk about anger, it's the why is this happening to me, right? I'm a good person. Why is this happening to me? Why did this, tragedy happen in my life? And people become really have a real visceral reaction, and anger to it. The bargaining process, and that's really, I'll do anything to change this, right? If you just allow this to happen, give me 5 more minutes, give me one more day, I'll do whatever I can. I'll trade this, and we bargain. We try and get more time. The depression phase. What's the point of going on after this loss? My loved one's gone. There's nothing left to live for. My life will never be the same. That type of thing. And then the acceptance phase, which is it's going to be okay, right? You're picking up the pieces. You're understanding that my loved one is gone, or your loved one is gone. And, this is a part of the process, right? From life to death. So those are the 5 Kubler-Ross stages in general, and I want to make sure people kind of have an understanding. Everyone has to go through a death process, right? There's a couple of theories that state, even from a biological perspective, that death causes kind of an ever-present anxiety, right? Because we all know at some point there's birth, and then at some point there's death, and there's some theorists that believe that throughout the course of life, there's an ever looming anxiety about death. But as we bring in brother Walter into this process, we will start to kind of see that we prepare for death, and we prepare for this process of grieving from a very early stages. That's just a quick overview, Brother Sterling, about the Kubler-Ross stages, and we'll certainly have more, but I don't want to dominate that conversation.
Well, jump on in, brother. Dr. Wilson, you want to add to that?
I thought that was a great introduction to what we're going to be talking about today. And I don't have as much to add. The one thing that I will say, as a child and adolescent psychiatrist specifically, one of the things that I think we can touch on today, as brothers in the fraternity, we're often called upon, whether it's in our jobs or our communities or even our families, to support others through grieving, right? So obviously we're going to be talking about giving brothers skills on how what to look out for, to know what is grieving, when has grieving shifted to something else that we really need professional help for, but also how do we help, our children and our teenagers through grieving, because that can be a very nuanced process for them, depending on the specific stage where they are developmentally. They can show and express grief in very different ways. And as leaders of our families, as leaders of communities, we need to be able to identify those things and have age-specific ways to support our children and teenagers. And so
let's get to that. Sorry to interrupt. We're definitely going to be talking about all of that. And for those in the audience who are keeping score, there's a mnemonic associated with that we all learned back in college or med school or wherever it was, and that's DABDA, right? So the D is denial, A for anger, B for bargaining. The other D is for depression, and then you finally get to acceptance. So you can check that and see if you're currently grieving, where you are along the process, because things really do tend to progress in that manner. Let's pick up what you guys were putting down there and talk about that. One of the things I found especially fascinating is that sometimes grief doesn't just occur with death. There's so many chronic illnesses in which people have no opportunity to recover. So grieving can occur quite early before someone has passed. So I'd like for you two to actually discuss how we can empower ourselves to be prepared for grief, and on the flip side, how we actually can cope with grief. So let's just, one of you pick it up and just jump in from there, please.
Well, and isn't that pretty interesting, Brother Dr. Sterling? When we talk about that kind of anticipatory grief, right? The technical term of it. When you know that there is a terminal illness, a chronic illness that's going to lead to death at some point. Um, there's a way for us to kind of anticipate. Oh my gosh! At some point, there's this inevitable process of death, right? And so I've got to kind of get myself prepared for it. I got to start talking to family. Hopefully, certainly, I'm painting a picture that's pretty healthy from a psychological standpoint, where folks are kind of processing this in advance. But when you anticipate that process of awareness of impending loss or death, I think that is very different. And I'm certainly interested in both of your opinions. I think that's very different than kind of an acute tragedy where there's a car accident, some type of loss, someone shot, killed, that type of thing, where you don't have that time to anticipate the grief. I think that's a little bit different. When we can anticipate that grief, we have time to process. We have time to say some things, to do some things, to put some things in order, as opposed to that kind of acute, kind of emergent process. But again, Dr. Wilson, what's your thoughts on that?
I totally agree with you, right? And you are going to have different reactions based on, the way that whatever led to the grief, or the way that loss was experienced, right? So it's very different to be able to prepare for months or years for a parent to pass away who is sick and it's coming, and you get, like you mentioned, doing things and saying things in that time period to be able to prepare yourself and prepare them, to leave. And so I think, that's very different, obviously, than someone who dies very suddenly, or what we often see in our offices, in addition to what we mentioned, right? If this does turn over to mental illness, which is when people die tragically, right? Or people die violently. And so those are much harder for people to cope with, and understandably so, right? Especially if they witnessed it. That's where we start to think about, are they dealing with PTSD or depression or anxiety? But the reality is that even if, before we even get to talking about actual mental illness, just the grieving process and going to a therapist for that can be okay, right? And you don't have to be suffering from an actual mental illness to be able to have someone help you with your grieving process. And the only other thing that I would add is, when we think about specific loss and how to prepare for it, if we look at the children and the teenagers in our lives, one, it's important to recognize that loss comes, in more forms than just someone passing away, right? For a 10-year-old, that can be divorce, and now you live with mom or you live with dad, and you don't get to see mom or you don't get to see dad as much. There's grieving in that process. Or a child you move because of your job. A child's life can change because of that. They can leave their friends, and that can be the grieving process. So for children and adolescents, which may be very different than adults, the grieving process not only shows up differently, but also what's understood to be grieving, right? It doesn't have to be somebody or a pet passing away, right? That can hit a child much harder than it does an adult. And so be able to recognize those things.
Yeah, the process, and there's certainly a lot to unpack there, but those type of reactions, those typical, putting up my air quotes, reaction, right? Those regressive behaviors. Certainly you can see it in adults, but I think it's very clear in children, right? Bedwetting, temper tantrums, things of that nature. You certainly can see in children, but you can see it in adults. The kind of magical thinking, right? And again, not highlighting that this is mental illness, because I think that's important. Brother Wilson, you said this, I thought really powerfully. Grieving is not mental illness. And people need to kind of understand that the process of grief is not mental illness, right? It's that prolonged period, that prolonged response where you start to go, okay, now I'm not doing other things, right? I'm starting to get into the depression mode. I'm not taking care of my ADLs. I'm not eating. I'm not, doing things to thrive in life. That's when you get over into mental illness. The process of grief in and of itself is not a mental illness, but the sadness, the mood changes, the outbursts, the feelings of anxiety, the feelings of being helplessness, um, isolation, loneliness, right? Those are kind of common grief reactions. And certainly, Brother Wilson, I'm going to toss this back over to you because I think it's magnified, right? We're kind of coming out, knock on wood, coming out of COVID, but it's magnified when we are unable to congregate with others, right? When we have to, be by ourselves or not be able to go to those services, those typical traditions to say goodbye. When we had that restriction, that kind of magnifies it. So I don't know if you agree or disagree with that.
I totally agree, and that hits on a really important point, which is when you think about cultural considerations, and we'll take the communities of color, we'll take Black community for an example. It's the evidence is very clear that when it comes to grieving, Black communities are very prone to reaching out for not only family support but community support. So now think of that in terms of COVID shutdown and losing a loved one during that time, but not being able to congregate with people in your community that would normally be there, right? Or your family members can't come over and that type of thing. And so, so even the cultural considerations within our communities were halted by the shutdown necessarily, but it, again, then the grieving process changes, right? Or it has to adapt. And so
Right,
how do you
right.
deal with that more alone?
So let me get back to that because I am always mindful that we're providing information, but we also are empowering our audience. And you guys just did such a masterful job there of laying out a consideration about preparing for and coping with grief. And I do appreciate the difference between the episodic and tragic deaths that occur versus the long-term deaths that occur. And I'm framing this because I want to discuss both a personal anecdote and a personal observation. When my mother died, it was at the culmination of a singular event that came with an 80% probability of her having died. She had a subdural hematoma, and thanks to some great medical intervention, she was able to live another 8 years. So at the time of her ultimate passing, I and my family were actually able to approach her impending death with some celebration of her life. And we know that particularly in New Orleans, people really do fancy the act of celebrating people's passing as much as they do mourning their loss. So I want you both to talk about how to incorporate that appreciation of one's life in the midst of the devastation that occurs when people lose their loved ones, because that is both a sign of strength, of mental health, but it certainly is not disrespectful to your loved one at a time in which the loss should make you sad. But as a coping mechanism, can you just speak to how people can be more mindful of that, or is there a time frame along the grieving process where you believe that that's more able to be done?
Yeah, it's a great point, and whether it's there in New Orleans, it's through our kind of spiritual makeup, it's through kind of preparing. There's a great book that I like to kind of reference when we talk about grief and loss. It's called The Four Things That Matter Most. It's by Dr. Ira Brock. I don't know if either one of you are familiar with it, but it talks about um, doing some things, saying four particular things, and I'm going to tie this back to what you were talking about, Brother Sterling, so that you become comfortable, so that you can reconcile the fact that, oh, this loss has occurred. right? This loss has occurred, and now I can move on, kind of reset my life so that I can kind of progress forward, right? That kind of new normal. In the spiritual context, celebrating life. Those of us who, have a spiritual center, a spiritual set point, we talk about, the homegoing service, the process of celebrating life. It's our way to cope, right, with the death in a positive, healthy way, and it's also our way to kind of say we'll be okay, right? My loved one is gone, but I can remember good things, right? I can I can have a conversation with others and smile and laugh or cry or feel however I want to feel. And I can know that regardless of what happens from this point forward, if I need to reach out to my loved one that's deceased, I can think about that. I can ask them questions. I can
But Brother
hear
Hinton, how do
them.
we get there? How do we get there? Because we've all been to the funerals where people were hanging on to the casket. Take me with you. We've all heard that, right? And to develop a skill where you are both appreciating and mourning simultaneously is not something that's natural. You point out it may be cultural, it may be spiritual, but is there something that we can give the audience to help with that perspective? Is it something that should be talked about within the family, or do we just have to let people go through this on their own and get to that point?
I I'm sorry. I think it's both, right? I think there are things that we can do. I'm going to talk specifically about the four things because this is something I've given my patients before. I've given friends and family. There are four things essentially that Dr. Brock talks about that if you are able to say and experience, you're able to reconcile the death a little bit easier. Please forgive me. Please forgive me. I forgive you. Thank you. And I love you.
Yes.
Please forgive me. I forgive you. Thank you. I love you. Right? To be able to say those four things, and I'm certainly giving it to you in a very simplified form for this purposes, but to say those four things either to your loved one before they die, or even to say them after they die to yourself, to be able to go through each of those steps. Forgive me for dot dot dot, whatever it is that you need to be that you need to ask for forgiveness from that particular person, right? That's something between you and them. I forgive you, right? I forgive you for leaving me. I forgive you for XYZ experience. But to really embrace that process that I forgive. Thank you for being a part of my life. Thank you for helping me. Dot 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 dot. And then I love you, right? That process of knowing within yourself, within your heart, certainly thinking about it, that regardless of the fact that they are not here physically, I still can say I love you, right? You, Brother Sterling, you talked about your mom. I am confident to say there's not a day that passes that you don't go, boy, I really love my mom, right? And to be able to say that and experience that allows you to reconcile, allows you to go, I'm okay with letting her physical body go, right? Her physical presence go, because I now know that that person's with me forever, right? I can celebrate their life. I can talk to my kids in there. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was agreeing with you. And I think that, again, we're sharing a little bit in this conversation we're having. I used to always say about my mother, and perhaps this is going to resonate with those who are religious or otherwise spiritual in the audience. Given the degree to which my mother was a very spiritual and religious person, I was actually able to celebrate the fact that if there is a heaven above, I know she was going to be in it. So why would I be saddened that she has crossed over? And the difference between her physical life and her spiritual life and her eternal life is once again something to have been celebrated. Now, I know that that's mental gymnastics, but we're bringing this up to try to share with the audience things that they may find helpful as coping mechanisms. Jump on in there, Dr. Wilson. What's your thoughts? Anything to add there?
was going to say, you all really brought up some great points. And the only thing that I would add, just from a tangible standpoint, what can you actually do is oftentimes what we want you to do as mental health providers so that that grief isn't prolonged and we don't get too caught up in the grieving process, where it's extended, it's prolonged, is continuing your daily routine, like celebrating the loss by continuing your life in memory of, right? And so I think, if you go to the gym, don't stop going to the gym. If you're working hard in school, keep going to school, or whatever it is at your job, whatever it is. Making sure that now you have kind of increased fuel, like changing your mental framework to identify what you do on a daily basis, especially the habits and kind of activities, even activities that you may have shared with this person, right, that you continue to do in their honor, and that can be a way of grieving, right? You can grieve by continuing those activities
Absolutely.
that you all shared. And so that's a great way, just tangible, stick to your routine, things like that.
And isn't it funny if we think about the process of a church service, right, a homegoing service, celebrating the life of our loved one. Those processes always say, hey, don't be afraid, don't be sad, right? Keep going. Your loved one would want you to ... to progress. Your loved one is proud of what you're doing, because it's those kind of hidden roadmaps that we all experience that prepares us to deal with grief effectively, right? And I'm sure we're going to get to when people don't deal effectively with grief, but there is certainly within our community, there is a roadmap that we start going down at a very young age about how to deal with death. Brother Sterling, you said you were sharing a personal kind of story and situation. I will share that as well. My maternal grandmother would often tell myself and my cousins, death is only a problem for the living, right? That's only once you die, you're good, right? Because if you believe in the Lord, you believe in heaven and hell and things of that nature, then you are going. Knock on wood, you're living a good life. You're going to the good place, right? And that's something to look forward to, right? It's the rest of us that are left here on this side that have to kind of deal with, oh my goodness, mom's gone, dad's gone, grandma's gone, that type of thing. But we start preparing for that at a very young age. Most of us. Now, certainly there are some outliers and exceptions to that, but most people, you're going to those gatherings, you're going to the repast, you're talking about stories, you're laughing, you're crying, you're doing all those things, and you're being told it's going to be okay, keep going, right? They're so proud of you. You're all those things to help you stay clear of it going towards depression or continuing anxiety. So I just wanted to share that. I think it's
fantastic.
Go ahead.
No, fantastic. We'll keep it going. We have a lot to discuss and a lot of questions that are coming in. So let's keep this moving. You mentioned earlier, and by the way, for the audience members that didn't get it, I think both gentlemen actually talked about it. And Brother Hinton, you mentioned specifically ADLs. I just wanted to clarify that's activities of daily living. And Brother Dr. Wilson pointed out, you really would do well to embrace the habits that are part of your day and to pay attention as to whether or not you can keep those things going. That is a path toward good mental health in the face of this. And I would actually add an additional consideration. If you can connect to your loved one through the activities that you shared with that person, that is a way to maintain relationships with them into the long run. And I assure you that you're going to focus more on the positive things that you shared, whether it's your mutual favorite meal or something that you did, a walk in the park to a special place. Those types of things are good ways to cope with grief and to really turn it towards something that turns their lives into a cherished memory and to part of your life that you'll take with them, with yourself, and pass on potentially to others. So I think it was Brother Hinton that mentioned anticipatory grieving. I'm also fascinated at the notion of participatory grieving, and we've talked about that a little bit. And one of the sad parts of this conversation is that sometimes people that are mourning, and we'll frame it as mourning instead of just grieving, are expected to get over it, which is one of the most horrible things can ever be said to someone who has lost a loved one. Can you just briefly discuss the time frame for normal grieving, or perhaps I should say how there really isn't a normal time frame for grieving or a time frame for normal grieving, in a way that lets people know that it's okay to still care even after a point in time in which others would have expected you to move on?
Yeah, this is, I think, a question that people really struggle with. Um, how long is too long, right? To actually be grieving, right? Is it 6 months? Is it 2 years? Is it somewhere in between? What happens if it's more than that? And there's really some other data points that I think really needs to come into play when you start to say it's been too long. I've seen people grieve within that first month, and successfully transition into that new reset point. I've seen people who continue to grieve over the course of years. It really depends. For children, I'll turn that over to Brother Wilson, but I think it depends uh, on how they react and how they display their grief, and to see if you can kind of track that over time. Brother Wilson, what's your thoughts on the time period there?
Yeah, I think you mentioned something important, which is people, grieving is normal. We've said that from the very beginning, but, there really is no time frame for how long one can normally grieve. And in some cultures outside of the Black culture, people, mourn for a year. That's like, it's customary for them to traditionally mourn for a year. And so just healthy mourning. And so I think when it comes to uh, when oftentimes when people ask the question, when's too long to grieve, and when should I be concerned about something else, that's they're really speaking to what we would consider like severe grief symptoms, right? So when we talk about the ADLs that we mentioned, right, the activities of daily living, if you can't get out of bed, and you stop playing basketball with your friends, and it's been months for that, and you can't get to your job, and if you're functioning, your day-to-day functioning hasn't been impacted, so we would consider that severe, obviously, in our field. Then we start to look at timelines, right? So for children, for example, if you're looking at like what we call a complex bereavement disorder, things like that, we're talking about like 6 months, after the event, severe symptoms, right? Not just mourning. Like if the child is just mourning and missing their dad and crying, that's okay, right? But if they can't get up for school, if they're getting super aggressive, if they've been expelled because they're starting to fight and all those things, that's where we look at, okay, well, we shouldn't see severe grief symptoms that may tip over into depression and mood symptoms and other type of mood symptoms for about 6 months. And for adults, that would be about a year out, right? If you're mourning a year out in a healthy way, that's absolutely fine. You can mourn them for the rest of your life in a healthy way. But if you have severe grief symptoms to where you're not functioning, that at the 12-month mark should not be the case. And at that point, you should be looking for maybe a little bit more professional help. But again, the key point is severe and knowing yourself, right? And so,
Right, because then you're moving into the major depression at that point,
Yeah.
right? And so signs and symptoms of grief. Again, I'm going to keep underscoring. We're going to keep underscoring. This is a natural process, right? The physical signs of grief. People can feel exhausted. They can have ulcers, sore joints, things of that nature. Emotional signs of grief, when you're on the verge of tears. I see in one of the comments, someone said, I still feel heartbroken, right? Those are very much signs and symptoms of grief. Mental or attitudinal grief. I completely forgot something. You're overlooking things. You're kind of disorganized, and of course, spiritual, right? Having some spiritual conflict. I've been spiritual all my life. God has taken my loved one away. Maybe I'm questioning my faith. Those are very normal, very typical processes for people to kind of go through as they grieve the loss of a loved one. That doesn't mean that you have a mental disorder. It doesn't mean that you're weak. Doesn't mean that something's wrong. Those are very normal reactions to grief. I think, as Dr. Wilson said, we're talking about when it gets all the way over to this extreme side and you find yourself unable to go to work, right? Not day one, right? Day 368. That's when you start going, oh, okay, maybe something else is going on. Maybe I need to process this a different way. And then it is totally okay for people to say, hey, I need some help, right? I'm not able to function like I was functioning a year ago when my loved one was still here, and seeking out either talk therapy, seeking out a psychiatrist, seeking out going to your family physician, making sure that you are getting the help that you need and deserve.
So let me be clear on this. What we're saying here is that there is no normal time frame for grieving. Normal grieving can involve a lifetime of grieving. It's the incapacitation that turns this into something abnormal. So let's get into, you guys touched on it, but I really want to take it as a separate discussion topic. Let's talk about if and when grieving is ever a disorder itself. You talked about that 366th day. Is it more that grief can become incapacitating by itself, or does grief lead to clinical depression? Is it a gateway to clinical depression? Is it a trigger for clinical depression and other things? And is depression the problem itself, other than the grief? Are there individuals that are more prone to have depression and grief becomes the gateway? Because we expect, and you've just very eloquently discussed how grief is something that we all can live with healthily over the course of our lives. So I'm going to ask you to add some nuance into when people should consider their grieving a disorder, or just speak to how it is, when it is.
And sure, I can take that first. And so, one of the biggest things about, so grieving is grieving. Grieving is healthy, right? Just like we said multiple times. And that's something I want to reiterate, because that is a very, very important kind of point to hammer home, right? When we start to think about grieving tipping over into something else, what we're looking at is, and one of the things that is often has to be teased out in my office when I see patients is, I'll have, parents come in with children or adolescents or themselves and say, sometimes I wish that they took me, right? Or sometimes, my 13-year-old son says, oh, I wish I was with Uncle Johnny in heaven. That's and what I often tell them, because this is where it gets important, is that's actually normal. It's actually normal for people to want to be with loved ones even after they're gone. We start to get concerned, right? Or what I would offer to people who are listening to this, and again, this isn't medical advice, obviously, but watching out for your own mood. What you want to think about is, if you hear someone, or if you start to feel like harming yourself or ending your life to be with them, that's when you need to come see us, right? Or that's when you should start to think of, okay, well, maybe this is tipping over into a disorder, right? And so that's where, oftentimes, of course, when we talk about things like major depressive disorder, I always tell people that last D, it stands for disorder for a reason, right? That means somewhere in that you're not functioning well. And that's, if we want to clarify it and just kind of put a bow on it, that's the major difference that I would want people to recognize. You can cry every day and be healthy and get it out, and that all of that is all right, but it turns into a disorder when the grief symptoms start to truly affect your daily functioning. So again, if you're not doing the things that you used to do, if you can't get out of bed, if you're not eating, if you can't get over it, that's when you need to very likely seek a mental health professional. That's where so the grieving process, what I would imagine, I don't know the statistics on this, but the majority of people who grieve, which is going to be everybody at some point in their life, go on to a normal life. They don't have any depression. They don't have any anxiety. They struggle with, they grieve, and then they ultimately not move on like we talked about, which is not a good way to do it, but they move through it, right? They work through it. There's a smaller percentage of people who would go on to anxiety or depression. And so it's when your symptoms turn into a disorder, which is difficulty with your functioning, that's when we start to say, okay, this may no longer be grief, or we're struggling with grief to a degree where we may need some help with a little bit more help.
And I think, well said. And I think, Dr. Strong, you talked about, kind of how healthy are we to start, right? And this is where it's going to be important for people to not lie to themselves, right? If you were struggling with depression before, the death of your loved one, if you were struggling with anxiety before the death of your loved one, if you were struggling with mental illness before the death of your loved one, it's a good chance that it's going to be magnified as you deal and try and cope with this loss, right? So it's going to be important for you to stay in touch with, your treatment provider, whether that's psychiatrist, psychologist, counselor, what have you. It's going to be important to stay in touch with them and to stay current. If you're taking medications, if you're in therapy, you're in treatment, whatever that may look like, because it's going to get magnified. You're going to be dealing with the loss, the normal grief process, plus those other things, right? So don't lie to yourself. Don't pretend like nothing else is going on. I'm just going to deal with this, because all these other things in life are still going to be happening, right? All your other stressors are still there, right? Even as we grieve. So if we were already having some difficulty, chances are we're still going to be having difficulties with this particular loss. So hopefully, Brother Sterling, that kind of answers part of your questions.
That's just outstanding, brothers, and thank you for that. And to the audience again, I just love the way that this was framed. It's okay to grieve. Think of moving through the grief instead of getting over it. You can't say it any better than that. Move on to your life. Now, here's something I want to flip this part of the conversation. You touched on it a little bit already. There are cultural considerations and spiritual considerations in how people internalize and receive and are allowed to grieve. Let's actually talk about how cultural and spiritual considerations can be used to cope with grief. That's a different consideration, because part of moving through the grieving process is tapping into the resources and the support and mechanisms that we have in place. So please take a moment and talk about either side of it, both how we are allowed to express grief because of our surrounding cultural and spiritual considerations, and how we can use those considerations to help move through it on the other side.
It's an understanding, isn't it? Isn't it an understanding, right? Again, and we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier. Our spirituality and the process of grief, the process of death, right? It helps us understand what is happening, right? Okay, my loved one is gone. There was a terminal illness, whatever, what have you. Even if there was a tragedy, and we haven't really talked about this, the tragedy point of it, but even if there was a tragedy, they're in a better place, right? They're going to heaven, right? They're no longer suffering. They don't have to deal with da 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 da. All of these ways, all of these kind of signals, all of this information allows us to cope a little bit more effective, right? It allows us, I use the term reconcile. It allows us to reconcile that this loss has occurred, right? That this major void in my life is now, open, but I am able to move on because I believe, right, that they're in a better place. I believe that at some point I'm going to be able to join my loved one, right? I believe that this is all, for the greater good, a part of God's plan, a part of this journey. All of those things are all of those kind of pathways information points or ways that we cope with that loss.
I would agree. Yeah. And so, we often talk about spirituality with the Black community because, again, it's evidence and data. It's pretty clear that the Black community, at least in the U.S., it's often very much tied centrally to some level of spirituality, right? Whatever that is, Church of God in Christ, or I'm the son of a Baptist preacher, and so I grew up with it, right? And so I think being able to, from a tangible standpoint, how do you utilize your spiritual networks? You lean on your church family if you're comfortable doing that, right? If you're connected to a church family. If not, you may lean on your Bible. You may lean on the teachings of the Bible or whatever it is. And so I think not being afraid to tap into those things that provide resilience, and we know connection to a higher power as far as mental health is concerned, actually is protective of things like depression and anxiety, having a spiritual belief. And it doesn't mean it has to be God. It can just be any type of spiritual belief that you have. And so making sure you understand that if that's a part of your life, don't let that lapse. Don't have your church family looking for you when you need them the most, right? You be out there and you get your help and, speak to your pastor and those types of things. And so I think that's a big cultural consideration. And really quickly, Brother Melvin talked about, even in the racial aspects, right, to cultural/racial aspects to grieving. If there was a racial component to whatever happened, like he talked about, we haven't talked much about tragedies, right? And so, for example, maybe that loss is a loss through something racially charged, right? Unfortunately, in our country, there are events that happen to Black males and Black females that are perpetrated based on race, right? And so now you have grief combined with racial trauma, and how do you deal with that, right? And so I think being able to understand how to cope with those things, not only relying on church family from a spiritual standpoint to help with the grieving, but racial socialization, just talking with people, talking with your family about how to deal with your role as say for me, a Black man in this country, and what that means in the context of what I just experienced. Those are ways to help us protect against these things tipping over into depression and anxiety.
Fantastic. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out that for Blacks in America, African Americans, there's an intersection with culture and spirituality. Since the days of slavery, we have pointed toward the end of this physical life as a time in which we'll go to a better place. We have held on and used that belief as a way to struggle through structural racism and so many other trials and tribulations that occur during this life. Now, of course, there's some illogic that occurs in the midst of the grieving process, but we would do well to help each other tap into that consideration that we've used to get through this thing called life when it comes time to actually send our loved ones off, at least mentally. So thank you for that. Let's tap into some specialty considerations, and you've touched on this a little bit as you've done a lot of these things, but I really want to get into not just specialty considerations, but circumstances that bear mentioning. I think it was Brother Hinton that talked about children, and I want you just to touch on how children grieve, and we also want to discuss how important it is to understand what grief means to the elderly population as well. So let's take a few minutes and talk about both of those, because those are critically important, even life-threatening considerations in one of those examples. Let's get into that.
So certainly for children, child adolescents, I will defer to Brother Wilson, but the kind of basic do's and don'ts, right? When you're dealing with a child, whether it's your child, niece, nephew, and they're kind of experiencing grief, right? Be honest with them, be clear with them, be direct with them, let them know what's happening, right? Because whether you want to have that conversation or not, they're thinking about it, right? And I think one of the things that you want to avoid is to be dishonest with them, right? Grandma's gone, not grandma's, coming back next week, or, a year from now, we'll see grandma again. No, you need to be honest with them. Let them know that this is a normal process, right? Um, One of the things that I've told my own son, again, similar to what my grandmother shared with me at a very young age, is this is a part of the life process, life and death, right? So whether you want to kind of understand that, man, these feelings are going to come back again, we're going to go through this maybe a couple times in our life cycle, they need to know that it's normal, right? They need to know that it's okay for them to ask questions about life and death, right? And know that you, the parent, are going to be responsive and able to have that kind of conversation, right? Now, of course, then that gets into, you have to be healthy and you have to be able to withstand those type of questions. But those are just a couple of the do's and don'ts. But Dr. Wilson, I'll turn that over to you, because this is your area of expertise.
Yeah, no, I think the biggest thing when looking at grieving for children and adolescents is understanding our own expectations of what grieving for them looks like, right? I think a lot of times there's our understanding of how, say, for example, a child from 3 to 5 years of age, how are they, grandma just passed away, but you're worried that they're joking about it, or they think grandma's going to come back, like Brother Milton said, where it's their understanding. I mean, if we look from the very beginning, even infants 0 to 2 will react to a caregiver who's passed away, right? But it's how do they react, right? They react by maybe crying a little bit more, being a little bit more irritable, because that sense of comfort is not there. So the other caregiver has to step in. When I started talking about toddlers, and again, if I pull back for a second, every child is different. So these are generalities, right? You have to understand your own child. It's the important thing is to make sure that they have a safe space to discuss these things and to validate how they're feeling, regardless of how it is expressed. But very quickly, toddlers don't understand the finality of death, right? They don't have that understanding. They don't have the concept yet. So if you tell them, for example, grandma is dead and grandma's not coming back, they won't see it that way, like, because they may be interacting with characters and toys where one dies and they get right back up and they start playing, right? They just don't have an understanding of that finality, where school age children start to get a sense of the finality of it, but they may talk about loved ones being lost as like ghosts or spirits, right? That kind of thing. So they're starting to understand more of the finality. But then when you get to pre-adolescence, 10 to 12 or so, they understand the finality of it and they realize that it's an inevitable part of life. And then you get to adolescence and they tend to think about it more like adults do. But the way typically that teenagers will struggle with grieving is they don't know how to balance their autonomy versus how much support they want from their parents, right? So you might see to whereas you see a pre-adolescent who may act out more, teenagers tend to withdraw, right? And so I think when we understand developmentally what children and teenagers will bring to the table for grieving, and again, every child is different, these are generalities, then our frustration as guardians and leaders in our communities and families, I think, goes down a bit, and we know how to guide them, right, based on what they're presenting.
And I think you kind of touched on this at the end, and I saw one of the comments in the post about, how do we suggest people consider professional help? And I think particularly with the kids, you just touched on it, right? We have to make it acceptable and accessible for people to ask for help, right? Your kids, whether they're coming to you and you're making it normal, you're making it okay for them to ask for help, or you're saying, hey, if I can't give it to you, I'm going to make sure you get it, right? We're going to go, we're going to talk to, Dr. Wilson, Dr. Hinton, Dr. Sterling, or, Counselor Smith or Pastor Jones, whatever the case is, you make a pathway for that to be okay, for that to occur, right? you don't hide it from them. You know, there's a question that says, you know, what age should children begin to attend funerals? I think that's an interesting question, right? And I think it may be very personal for some folks. I don't think there's a too early of an age for that to happen, because again, it's a ritual, it's a process to say this is going to happen and we're going to be okay. We're going to get together, we're going to celebrate life, we're going to talk about this, we're going to cry, we're going to laugh, we're going to do all these things because that's a part of it. You know, the old saying, I haven't seen my cousin, my, you know, fourth, fifth cousin since the last funeral. Well, every time we get together, then, you know, we laugh and giggle and we say, oh, we're going to get together. But that's a process, right? We don't lie. We don't shield it from them, right? That's, at least that's my opinion.
I've always loved the framing of these things as celebrations of life. Just something to think about. Let's go to the flip side and let's talk about the elderly. Is there a qualitative difference in how the elderly mourn? I know that in our last webinar where we were talking about life expectancy, we touched on some of this, and I'll have some comments as well, but share with us how the elderly cope with grieving in ways that people should be aware of and are important.
I'm sorry, do you want me to go first? I think this really gets into that developmental aspect of life that we all are going through, right? You very specifically, Brother Sterling, said elderly, right? And so at that point, hopefully, if people have progressed through developmental stage as well, they're at a point where they're doing a lot of reflection, right? They're doing a lot of looking back and going, okay, my kids, my grandkids, maybe my great grandkids, right? Did I accomplish what I needed to accomplish, right? Are we in a better place as a family unit, right? Was I able to, you know, successfully navigate a career, job, what have you, and get to a point where now I'm going, I'm okay, right? That's a very different end of life stage process when I'm thinking about, am I transitioning to death, right? Time since birth, time to death. When I'm transitioning to death, if I can say, I'm okay, right? This is pretty good. I've got grandkids, I've got great grandkids, my children are fine. My spouse will be okay, whatever the case is. There's a little bit more of a peace to that. Again, thinking about a healthy developmental process, Brother Sterling. So I think it is a little bit different for people who are seniors. I think they make some very specific choices. This is how I want my end of life to be, right? I do not want to be hooked up in life-saving machines in the hospital. I don't want to go through that. People are able to make a very conscious choice about what they want that to look like. And that definitely has a bearing on their overall well-being.
Right. Absolutely. And I'll add very quickly, just, you mentioned looking at it from a developmental standpoint. I think that's a really healthy way to look at it because, one of the biggest differences, with the senior age group, if we're talking about 65 and older, is, that's drastically different from when you're younger for the most part. Is when you're younger, you understand loss as something that's a little bit more like extended from yourself. But when you're a senior, that's very different than your contemporaries and your peers dying around you, right? And so you're much closer to passing away, and your understanding of passing away as something that's, obviously inevitable, but something that may be closer than a lot of people are comfortable talking about. That's why we have geriatric psychiatrists, because just like we have child and adolescent psychiatry, you have a specialty fellowship for that, because that's a very important stage of life where you view death and loss differently. And so I just think it's important to recognize that as well.
I'm going to add a programming note here and let people know that your comments and questions that you've put in the chat are wonderful, and we want to address all of those. So we're going to add 15 minutes to the conversation so that we can address these things. But gentlemen, although I will say that everything that you said obviously is standard of care, state of the art, and supported by the evidence, I have suspicions about these things. I think that the tide is changing. First of all, let me double back on what you said, because I've always found it fascinating that the single largest risk for death is the death of a spouse. And I've seen this more times than I can describe in an emergency department setting, where someone who passes, you literally are asking about their family history, and you discover that in the preceding 2 years, they've lost their spouse. So for an elderly population, that is such a devastating event in their lives, as opposed to younger, where some deaths are tragic, some deaths are due to chronic diseases. At that point in life, what we see, and I'm putting this in the context of our most recent conversation on life expectancy, at that point in time, as you framed it, yes, people are looking at the quality of their life and how they've achieved the goals in their life, for example. But at the same token, they're also looking at their social networks and seeing that all of their friends have passed, or many of their friends have passed, and they're questioning what it is they have to live for. Now, we have to put that in the context of, if this is happening to you and your loved ones, to the members of the audience, the death of a spouse is a particularly important time for you to put your arms around your loved one and to make sure that they are being cared for and shown that love. Because one of the things that we talked about recently in terms of continuing to promote life expectancy is that if you are a person that is able to talk to your loved ones that still remain on a daily basis, that actually is something that will extend your life expectancy. So just kind of keep that in mind. Don't leave them to wither off and be depressed on their own. The other thing that I want to throw back at you, and this really is getting to the end of the conversation before we deal with the questions. I think the tide will change. I think the data in the next generation will reflect that with the advent of baby boomers getting older, and with the life expectancy ballooning, COVID-19 reductions aside, the way in which life expectancies are increasing, I think the people are going to go past the traditional framework of saying, I've lived a good life, it's time for me to go, to living a life to where they say, hey, I'm 65 years old. Now that I've made it to 65, I have an additional 25 years of life expectancy. What can I do with it? We now have octogenarians who are vying for the presidency, or would be octogenarians. So that part of the conversation is quite fascinating. And in putting it in terms of how people grieve, I think that a lot of this is going to be people who are looking for new reasons to hold on to. Maybe they want to have a more intimate role in their great-grandchildren's lives, and will use that to hold on to and to compensate for the loss of their peers. So would you guys agree with that sentiment, and forecast how people can actually enhance their life expectancy with these coping mechanisms that we've been talking about over the course of the past hour?
Yeah, but I think that's also something that is being prepared for, right? You know, I think to myself, my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, I think they were married for, I don't know, 56, 57 years, right? And my maternal grandfather passed first, and then a couple of years later, my maternal grandmother passed. And I think you're right. I think there is a sense of, okay, my life partner literally is gone. There's not too many things that I kind of want to do with anybody else now at this point, anyways, and not even in a in a depressive way, but I can remember asking my grandmother, oh, don't you want to go do this? And she would tell me, no, that's usually something me and your grandfather would do. I don't really want to do that with any rest of you guys, and so I think, that part is different. But I think now people aren't getting married as early as they once did in life. Not to get into a conversation about the institution of marriage, but I think people are going, yeah, I do see myself living a life beyond my partner, or if my partner doesn't make it, I can see traveling the world or doing something else. But I think those conversations are actually happening now to prepare. I think people are talking to each other and going, hey, if I, was to die before you, I would want you to X, Y, and Z. So I think some of those conversations are still happening earlier than we really think.
Absolutely. Brother Wilson?
I was gonna say I totally agree, and I think there has been a shift because of the extended life expectancy that we have, in the U.S. And so, because of that, it's an entire, and again, that's why we call these stages, right? That's an entire stage of living, right? Before we're talking a lot about grieving and dying, but that's an entire stage of living. And so, what do you do during those years, particularly if your life partner is gone? And what do you fill that social support network with, and what type of activities are you doing? And so I think people having to be prepared for that part of their life can also lead to how and they're able to deal with grieving and deal with loss when people around them pass away. And so so I think there's definitely an opportunity there for people who are 65 and above to live a full life, have, there are senior centers opening everywhere, all of that kind of stuff. And so I think that helps prevent grief hitting them particularly hard, or at least, provides a supplement to their emotional kind of resilience, to be able to get through those things. And so.
Well, thank you. We're in the speed dial portion of the program. I'm going to give you gentlemen 30 seconds to address some of the great questions that are being asked here. So let's just see here. There's a question about recommending medicines to help people cope. We should probably distinguish that we're probably not talking about grief itself, but the sequela of grieving, including depression. Would you want to speak to the use of medicine for someone that's dealing with abnormal levels of grief?
Of course, yeah, I can jump in and start that. And I would say that's a very good question. And I'm glad we got to it, because I did see it in the chat. Because in our community, there's a huge stigma against what I do, right? Or what we do, myself and Dr. Milton. So because there's in the past, there has been medicine taking advantage of the Black community. So now when we have issues, we're kind of not standoffish, but we don't fully trust the psychiatric field, right? And so to answer that question directly, if you are feeling depressed, then you should seek out mental health treatment, right? And as a part of that, yeah, there could potentially be the use of antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications. Ask all the questions that you're supposed to ask. Obviously, your doctor is supposed to have a comprehensive evaluation to make sure that that's appropriate for you. No one should be giving you any medication as a provider without having a full understanding of who you are, what you've been through, and what you're actually experiencing. But I don't want our community to limit themselves from things that have been helpful. And so talk to a provider, talk to a particularly a medication manager. I would say, I'm a big proponent of, if you have medication, you should be in therapy. That's something that I think is important to say, because those things are designed to work together. And so I can't say that you should. I will say that don't be afraid of it. And I think in our community, we're often afraid of it, so we're the last to get the treatments. These things can be safe depending on your medical history, and we shouldn't be afraid to get mental health treatment. So should that be on the table, consideration if you're struggling with depression? I would say so, at least to discuss with your provider.
Yeah, I agree totally. It's kind of something that as a psychologist, I say to my patients all the time, medications work, right? They do work. You need to be informed about them, and certainly your physician needs to be informed about you. And I love that last piece that you put in there, Dr. Wilson, talking about the partnership of talk therapy and pharmacological treatment. But I would remind everybody, medications work. There is a reason why the chemistry in your brains function the way that they do, and that these things, these tools, are used to help us to cope and feel better, right? They're not a crutch. It's not a sign of weakness. It doesn't mean that you're going to be addicted to something. It means that you are seeking help for what's ailing you. And so I certainly would recommend people talk to their psychiatrists or physicians about that real tool.
All right, we have two more questions. One is a stylistic question that we want to offer to empower people that are dealing with family members. Let's, once again, it's been touched on, but let's elaborate. How do we let someone know that they should consider professional health without dishonoring their mourning process or appear to dishonor the person that's just passed? How do we offer professional help without offending the person that we're trying to get help to? And that should keep it to 30 minutes.
Yeah, I would just first say, stop beating around the bush, right? Stop worrying about, are you going to offend them, and offer them the help. Hey, I see you struggling. I see you are in need, and there is a pathway to help. Make it a normal part of the process. It may not be a one and done conversation, but you're setting the stage, you're planting the seed that it's okay. It's okay to ask for help. It's okay to get help.
Yeah, very quickly. I'll reemphasize that. Don't feel like you have to beat around the bush. And the understanding is that at a baseline, this person hopefully knows that you love them, right, and that you care for them. And I think it's very much okay to say, Uncle Johnny, I love you. I see that you're struggling, and they may deny that, and they may see it differently, and that's okay. And you validate those feelings. But I'm a very big proponent in my office and then outside of my office. Speak very directly from a place of love, what you notice, how they feel about what you're saying, and say, hey, it's okay to say, hey, I think we might need a little bit more help than what we're getting here. How do you feel about seeing a therapist? And I think putting it that way, to where, one, it comes from a place of love, and two, you're asking them how they feel about seeing a therapist, as opposed to saying you need to go to a therapist, right? That's where I think maybe the approach is not the best. And so I would say, how do you incur their feelings about seeing therapy, and been making sure you explicitly state to them, and this is why, because I'm seeing this from you. But have it come from a place of love. Be very direct.
Okay. How can Black men and fathers support adolescents in their families and communities who are dealing with grief? I'll start there. Create an environment in which it's okay for people to emote, express their grief, and move through it. What do you gentlemen want to add there?
Yeah, I think that's a complicated question. Certainly, again, creating that environment, showing them that there are pathways to help. But I also think to really talk about the realities of the environment, right? It should not be normal, and unfortunately, I think in our society and some of our communities, it's normal for child, adolescents, teenagers to experience death. That shouldn't be the case. And as adults, we should be reminding them that's not okay. It's not okay that you're seeing your 13-year-old friend who's dying or getting shot or getting killed or whatever. If that's the reality, you need to make sure that you're having those kind of conversations, those realistic conversations, and saying, no, this is not normal. And if this is happening, we need to talk about how to get us out of this type of environment, because it's not normalized.
Fantastic. Fantastic. I just, as a final consideration, it's critically important for us to allow our communities to become educated on this topic. We hope that you have enjoyed this evening's webinar and will choose to share it with your loved ones and refer back to it when you are in time of need. We have had two excellent panelists. Thank you, Brother Dr. Hinton and Brother Dr. Wilson Jr., and of course, our Deputy Surgeon General for Mental Health, Brother Dr. Ron Kennedy Bailey. for doing this. And good luck to you. This is not an easy topic, but it's a meaningful topic. We hope that you got what you needed or hope to get out of this conversation. And we'll see you back again in 2 weeks. And on that note, I will wish you good night and good luck. Thanks for being here.